Hello everyone, and welcome to Or This. This is my Monday morning quarterbacking for the sermon and the theme for the previous Sunday. And this is the video for the third Sunday of Easter, which was April 18th. I will put the scriptures in the scripture references in the description of this video for you to check out. But my emphasis in my sermon was on the first reading, which was a story in the book of Acts, and I focused on the way in which Peter, Jesus' apostle, referred to Jesus as the author of life. To give you a little bit of a setup, basically, of the story, Peter and John find a man who's begging at the gates of the temple. He's begging for financial assistance. And the reason is because he's crippled, and people who have physical ailments obviously can't work. But at the same time, in that society in those days, people who had any kind of physical disability, people who were crippled, people who were blind, people who were deaf, anybody who had trouble functioning in society because of a physical ailment, were also forgotten and left to fend for themselves. And there was a teaching of the time that basically if a person suffered from physical disabilities and ailments, and that it was punishment from God. So whereas we might think to ourselves, because of some of our study of faith, we might say, well, why didn't the faith community help? Well, the reason was because they were teaching, the religious leaders would teach that if people suffered, and it could be physical ailments, it could be people who suffered financially, they're poor, anybody who struggled because something in life happened to them that caused them to have struggles, that it was God's punishment, and they didn't want to get in the way of that. But Peter and John see this man who's begging for financial help, which he really needed, because not only he didn't have any, there wasn't anything set up by society that would help him, or the faith community that would help him. And actually, the other piece of this is that he wasn't allowed to be part of the faith community in the first place. He was an outcast because, again, they felt like God was punishing him. So, can't be part of this faith community because God apparently doesn't like you. So this was the understanding at the time. But Peter and John come upon him, and they see him begging, and they decide not only are they not going to give him money, but instead he's going to, by the power of the risen Christ, heal the man. So Peter heals him. And then people around see that this man is all of a sudden able-bodied and able to move around, and they're astonished. And so that's the story behind what Peter then goes on to say about who this Jesus is, that by whose name he healed this man. And then as Peter is talking to the people, he talks about how when Jesus was arrested, that Pilate was going to release him, but they gave the religious leaders and the crowd a choice, and they chose Barabbas and killed the author of life. That's actually what he says in verse 14. And you killed the author of life, whom God raised from the dead. And so in my sermon, I talked about Jesus as the author of life, which is a title that doesn't really come up in any other part of the Bible, but it kind of resonated with me this week, and I thought it was pretty cool. So that's the explanation for what happened. And so I did talk a little bit about stories and famous authors who are known with particular genres, and Stephen King with horror, and Agatha Christie with mystery, and all that kind of thing. And so I thought I'd talk about how some of us like certain genres that we like to read. I don't like horror, but I know that there are some people who like horror stories, and I don't know exactly why, but that's your preference to read, and so That's fine. Um, and so, some people like sci-fi, and sometimes some of us might not. But if that's what you like, that's great. And some people like romance, and we have our particular genres, and especially with romance, a lot of times there's kind of, unless you're reading the Christian romance, there's are sometimes some, can be sometimes like a soap opera a little bit, some things that happen, relationship struggles and things. So anyway, the point is that we might like different genres to read for fun. But what about when it comes to the story of life? The story of our life, the story of our collected life, the life that we live together in society, in our communities, in our country, in our world? What kind of author do we want to write that story? I'm thinking we don't want Stephen King. God bless you, Stephen King, great writer in your particular genre, but nope, we don't want Stephen King writing the story of life for us. And in this way, thinking about then Jesus, the author of life, because we don't want to see horror, we don't really want to see mystery or thriller, not in the ways that the books are written today, but we want to see the life of the risen Christ, bringing life to the places where people are not only struggling physically, but also being left out of society and disregarded and not heard and basically treated as an outcast. One of the reasons why this healing was so important, of course it was important because the man, was crippled and then he was able to walk around able-bodied. But one of the other important pieces was that this restored him to be able to be part of the faith community once again, which he should have been allowed to be part of in the first place, even when he was crippled. But humanity wasn't allowing that. And so Jesus, the resurrected Christ, the author of life, not only healed the man physically, but he also then provided the man the opportunity to be restored with the faith community. And through the healing to know that God acknowledged him and that God cared for him. And so he was healed. So think about life as a story that's being written. Think about the story that we want to see written on what's going on around us. Maybe your story right now is really a struggle, and so you're wondering what the next day and the next day, what that will look like. Think about the author of life. What does the author of life write into our lives? And then think about some of the conflict going on in our world today. Maybe it's not happening in your particular communities, but think about some of the struggles in our communities. There's always poverty. There's always families who need support. There's always maybe, especially during the pandemic, people who are feeling isolated. But even on a larger scale, if you live in a community where there are people of different ethnicities and different backgrounds, what is the author of life writing in the story of your community? And think about what the risen Christ did for this man to heal him and to restore him so that he might be in relationship with God and with his faith community. And we can know then that the author of life is writing stories that reconcile and restore relationship and that bring people together. And so to be part of that story, then how do we participate in ways that bring us together, that restore relationships where there might be some division, where we restore situations where there might be brokenness and sin and offense, people might have hurt one another. How do we restore these situations? Those are the stories that the author of life is writing, does write, has written, will always write. And so we give thanks for those stories, and we ask him to invite us in to be part of that story and that story be the one that's written in our lives and in our world going forward. So I'd be interested to hear some of your comments. Please feel free to leave them either on YouTube or on Facebook. And thank you for watching, and God bless.